swipe left, swipe right. No, we're not going to make a dating site. We are instead looking at the first thing that I was taught about DataFlex. And my master wasn't Mr. Miyagi, it was Sture Anderson. And he taught me, instead of swipe left, swipe right, he said, clear, move, find. And that's what we're going to look at today, because we're going towards the end of the series of data dictionaries and how to use them. And when you're inside a data dictionary, in one of these backout, update, create procedures, because then you cannot call the data using the data dictionaries file buffer. So you have to use the global buffer. And now it's finally time to look at how we work with the global buffer, or at least how we find things, because you have already seen some of how you do a regular save. So I'm going to touch on that in the end a little bit. But for now, we're going to focus on how to find data. And in the first sample here, we have a SQL statement that just gets some data from the item. And we would like to do this using regular DataFlex code. Nowadays, you can do a lot with SQL in DataFlex, but a lot of legacy systems still have the clear, move, find structure. And that's why we want to learn about it as well, because it's such a deep rooted feature of DataFlex. In SQL, you send this query to the database, and then you get a set of data back. But when you work in DataFlex, you're only looking at one row at a time, always. So keep that in mind, only one row at a time. So what we do here, in order to just do a regular select from the item list, we do a clear item. And I want to show you more or less what that means in this structure here. So you want to do a clear. So more or less what you do is you have a copy of this and you set this up as your reading buffer. And then you do a find greater or equal item ID. And this is one way you can do it. We're going to look at another way later. But what this does is that it actually tells you that it's going to use the ID index. And that's one other thing. In SQL, you can do this without having any indexes in your database. It might get a little bit slower, but when you're using DataFlex, you need to have an index. So what this one does, it sorts by the ID column and says, find me greater or equal than what we have here. And this one is blank, 0, zilch, whatever. So the first item we find is this item. So we take this and we put it into our buffer, the global buffer. While found, let's print this. So that's what we're doing here. We're printing this. Then find greater than item ID. So now we're looking here. We say we have 1. If we were to do a greater or equal, GE, we would find this one again because the ID is equal to 1. So you would find that one. So that's why we do a greater than. So that's when we move down here. And now what DataFlex does, it's copying this data into our buffer instead, and now it's printing that line. And it continues to do that throughout the data while it's looping, while some data is found. And when we get to the end of the list, there is no data found, and it exits the list. And you can do whatever you want with the item you have loaded. So if you're looking for shrimp, for example, you can insert an if statement here that says if item.name equals shrimps, then change the amount or something. So you can work with the data while you're looping through it. And sometimes that's nice because you have full control of what you have. You don't have to push it into an array first and then loop through the array. But yeah, that's the basics of this clear, move, find structure. But you see there is no move here because we're not seeding the loop with anything. So we're starting from the first row in the list. Now I want to order by name, and that's easily done in regular SQL. But how do you do that in DataFlex? Well, you start by clearing, and then you find greater, and you could set item.name because then DataFlex will by itself figure out what index to use. Or you can explicitly set the item by index 2. And then if we go into our DataFlex, you can see that on item, index 2 has name and ID. And why do we have the ID in the index here? Well, that's because in this situation, name might not be a unique identifier. And we want to be able to find the name, even though there are two equal names. So we have to make all of these indexes unique. And that's why we are setting an ID, because there's only one ID of each. And then the name will not be forced to be unique because it's not a unique index in that sense. It's a little bit mind-bending when you come from a SQL world to look at this, but this is the way you make sure that this should not be a unique index. So now we're just doing the same thing with the index 2 instead. And you can see we have bike first, candles, candy, car. Now it's sorting by the name. The next thing we want to do is select where name like P. So now we only want to filter out those values where name, or those rows where name starts with P. And in DataFlex, we do that using a clear item. And here we get the move. So now we move P to item name. And if we look at our Excel sheet here, we take name and we actually clear this one. And then we go into name and type P. This is what's happening now. And now we tell the database to find greater or equal item by index 2. And if you look at index 2, you remember it was the name. So now it's sorting by the name and going down, finding something that is greater or equal to P. And this is not greater than P, not equal. This is not equals to P, but it's greater than P. So this row is what the DataFlex database will move into our buffer. Now the item is found. So we have an additional variable here to just make sure that we found the item. But we also want to make sure that it is a P in front of this item, and we will shortly get to that. But it is found. So we get in here, we print the name, you see down here, paint blue, and then we go to find greater than, and it's found something greater than, namely pots. Now we paste pots in here, and we go back in the loop and say it's still found. And we look at the uppercase left item 1, the first letter, and it says P, still, great. So we're still in the loop. We're printing the pots. Now find greater than. What's greater than pots? Well, it's shirt. So we take shirt, we load it into our buffer. We go back to the while loop. It is found. Then we check uppercase left first letter of the name, and it's not P. And that is why we're breaking out of this loop. Otherwise, it would just continue with all the other items here, like shirt, shoes, shrimps, and so on. It's really important to include this check here when you want to break out of the loop as well. But now I would like to do a join. I would like to include the name of the location because we only have a location ID here. And that's a little bit boring. And how do we go about doing that? Well, in SQL, you just do a join, and then we can order by the location ID if we want. In DataFlex, we go in and do a clear, get item by index 4, and while found, we go in here and clear the location, and then we move the item location ID to location.id. And now we can do a find equals location by ID. And we can do this because there is only one ID that matches what we're looking for. So that's why we have this equal. And if we look at the data dictionary, it starts out by sorting the location ID. So we have this sort here. And then we also clear this one. And when we find the first one by the index location ID, we get this post and it's 1. And then we go and look up this item ID in the location table. And since location ID is 1, we go down here and we just copy whatever is in ID 1 from the location into this second buffer, which is our location buffer. Now we go down the rabbit hole here and find greater than item by index 4. And that means that we go down to this one. And why does it go down to this one? Well, it's because the index actually is sorted first by location, then by ID. So I suppose that if we do it like this and then do it like that, we would actually get the correct. So we would start out by getting this one. Location is still 1, so we get this 1. And then this one is equal, but we want to find something greater. And since the index, first of all, has the location, but second of all has the ID is actually greater. So then we will find this post. Location ID is still 1, so we do a lookup on that and find 1. And we continue with the next step, and then the 14. But here the ID is lower again, but the location is higher, and the location is the first column in the index. So this one has precedence. So that's why we're getting this row. And now all of a sudden it says 2 here. So it will do a lookup again and find the second row to paste in here. So that's what's happening right here. We clear the location, we move the new location ID to the location.id of the location table, and then we find equals by the index 1. And we can also go into location and look at index 1, and ID is the first index in index 1. And you can see here we have the name, and we don't have an ID, and that means the name has to be unique in that table. Now let's go back. So what happens is we get this list, freezer and basement and so on. But what if we want to order by location name? Because now you have the basement and then the wardrobe and then the garage, and that is not really ordered by the name, it's ordered by the ID of the location. So if you want to order by the location name, how do you go about doing that then? Well, you start out by looking at the location in this case. So you can actually start by using the location by index 2, which is the name of the game, the name of the index. And in that case, we also have an additional found variable for the location variable. So we set found to be found, because found, as it is like this, is just a temporary variable used by DataFlex internally. So while be found is found, we go in and clear the item. And now, since we're at the first element of the location, you can imagine we're doing a clear of the location, and then we tell it to go by the index name. So this one is sorted by name, and then we find the first, and if it's found, we move it here. Now we have an ID, so we go up here and clear this one. We move this ID up here and say that we want to find all the items ordered by the location ID, starting with 6. Down here, when it says find greater or equal by index 4, and we have moved the location ID to the item.location ID, what it will find is this row. They will copy this row up here, so we keep the 6 here. And it will continue down this road until it comes to this one where it says 13. And that's important because then we need this additional check here that verifies that we're still looking at the same ID and same location ID. Because when we hit that point, we need to look at the next location that we want to get. And in this case, it should be location 2. Because basement has ID 2. So we put this one here instead. We set a 2 there. And now when we do a lookup in the item index, it finds the chair. So that's how it will continue going through these steps. And now you can see that we have the attic first, we have the basement, number 2, and then the box, freezer, and so on. So this is how you go about doing that. And now to the last 2 pieces I promised in the beginning. If you want to save something, if you want to make some updates, you could say if item dot location ID equals 2, for instance, then we want to change the name of the location to blank. And we always want to do the item dot name move. Yeah, let's move item dot name plus a hash to item dot name. So what we can do now is we can save item and save location. But we really don't need to save location, because when you use save, it is actually also saving the parent table. And in this case, the location is a parent to the item. So it will get saved. But there's also another one called saved record. And this one will only save the item regardless of what you've done to other tables. So if you want to make sure that you don't save some other table that has been updated in the record buffer, you prefer to use save record. But if you want to make sure that everything is saved, that is stored in the buffer, you can use a save. So that's the difference of those two. Remember that you can use the global buffer anywhere in DataFlex because it's the basic way to access the database. But if you do it in a view or somewhere else, you might conflict with what's in the data dictionary and cause issues. So if you haven't looked at my other videos about data dictionaries, you should look at those first. And with that said, I'm going to continue practice my swiping and my new movements, clear, move, find. I'm not sure. Well, see you next time. Bye-bye.